Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's AVATA Academy workshop, which will take us on a deep dive into utilizing sequence-dependent setups for capacity planning in Oracle ASCP. My name is Deb Bryant, Marketing Coordinator at AVATA, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Presenting for you today are Sanjay Agarwal, VP of Operations at AVATA, Nick Miller, Associate Consultant at AVATA, and Chandra Sripada, Principal Consultant at AVATA. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation, which is being recorded. We encourage you to submit any questions that you may have through the webinar side panel during the presentation. We will reserve time at the end of the webinar for Q&A, but we may also answer some questions as we go along. Our agenda today includes a very brief introduction to AVATA for those of you that may not know us yet, and then we'll dive directly into our content. So now I will turn it over to you, Sanjay.
Thanks, Deb. And hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Academy session. My name is Sanjay Agarwal, and I am the VP of Operations on the delivery side at AVATA. Before we get started, let me take a minute to briefly introduce our organization. AVATA is a certified Oracle partner that has been helping organizations to get the most value out of their Oracle on-prem VCP, such as Demantra, ASCP, production scheduling for a better part of 18 years. We also specialize in supporting our customers with their Oracle Cloud ERP and Cloud Supply Chain Management initiatives and implementations. We take a process-first approach and apply the best practice from a business process perspective with senior system expertise to ensure that you are using your Oracle applications in an effective and efficient manner. Today's topic is centered around ASCP and specifically how to enable and leverage sequence-dependent setups. In this session, you will hear about the key setups required to enable this functionality. As Deb introduced earlier, leading the session today, we have two of our ASCP leads, Nick and Chandra. Over the last few years, both have been working closely on ASCP and have helped several of our long-standing VCP customers. With that, I'll turn it over to Nick. Nick?
Thank you, Sanjay. And thank you, everybody, for joining. We're going to be following this agenda today where we'll go through a very quick kind of concept definition and purpose. We'll go through the benefits of using sequence-dependent setups. Chandra will lead us through the setup process. We'll take a look at resource line scheduling before and after. We'll get into some dependencies and interactions, and then we'll open the floor for question and answers. So first things first, let's get an idea of what sequence-dependent setups are and why they exist. Sequence-dependent setups is functionality in Oracle Advanced Supply Chain Planning that can be used to minimize resource downtime due to changeover activities. It helps ASCP make planning decisions on how to sequence work orders on production lines. And this will result in correctly accounting for capacity lost to changeovers and provide a better estimate of capacity used to perform value-added production activities. Sequence-dependent setups can be used for planning both discrete and process manufacturing activities. Our presentation today focuses mainly on discrete manufacturing, but some examples of industry applications for discrete and process include operations that employ colors such as paints and dyes. You'll see that this is the example that we use throughout today's presentation. Operations that use flavors, where there's ingredients that have a strong flavor or potential allergen that may require a full FDA cleanout. Operations where there's strong aromas, such as perfumes and scented oils, where there is a scale of intensity and the desired sequencing is such that we move from lower intensity to higher intensity throughout the progression of work orders in a given period. And then lastly, a little bit different, but resources where there is adjustability on the manufacturing line to accommodate different sizes, whether that is producing something of a different size, perhaps a container of some sort, or filling something of a different size. If that changeover requires significant time in order to adjust the resource line, ASCP can consider that the changeover time associated with that in order to sequence jobs such that changeover time is minimized. So here we see a very simple example of sequenced work on a paint line where we progress from light to dark paint, white to blue to black, so that changeover time is minimized for cleaning times between color changes. Note the changeover matrix that we have kind of in the lower right corner. Based on these changeover durations, where we go from white to blue to black, from blue to white to black, we see that without any penalties defined, which we will go into further detail on, ASCP, using sequence-dependent setups, will always try to move from white to blue to black in order to minimize changeover time. This changeover matrix is slightly more complex. By introducing a fourth color, gray, we see how much more complexity is involved. We see up to 24 possible combinations just by adding a fourth color. Note the yellow columns, which contain the changeover times between individual colors. And then in the far right column, we see the calculated, basically summed, changeover time by the given sequence. It's important to note that the least total changeover time may not always be the preferred sequence, which we will go into further detail on. Other factors considered are things such as due dates, penalties, and priorities. Now that we have a good idea of what sequence-dependent setups are and their purpose, let's talk about some general high-level benefits. First and foremost, sequence-dependent setups help reduce planned setup time or changeover time between manufacturing activities. We are basically improving our planned asset utilization within the ASCP supply plan. This improvement in the medium-term planning can also improve the timing of material requirements within the procurement planning process, so that we are purchasing materials closer to the time that they are needed. Thinking back to our paint example from a couple of slides ago, if we were to sequence from black paint to white paint, it's plausible that a certain volume of the white paint would likely be unusable, waste, or scrap, because it would contain some remnants of black paint. So if we're sequencing correctly, we reduce our material scrap and waste. Lastly, the improved ASCP plan can help us provide more accurate dates for any order promising or order fulfillment activities. In order to leverage sequence-dependent setup functionality, there are several data elements and parameter setups that are required. I'm going to turn it over to Chandra to walk us through some of that process.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So now I'm going to run through all the setups that are required at the ERP source side and also on the destination side, which is advanced supply chain planning. First, to start with, we need to set up the setup types. So we need to define all the possible setup types. And in our paints example that Nick has mentioned, for all the orders that are requiring black paint, we need to create one specific setup type for that activity. So the setup types are defined under for the navigation. We have to go to bill of materials, routings, and setup types. So this is where we set up one setup type for a specific activity. So once we set up the setup types, then we move on to assigning the setup types to resources. So for this, we again go to bill of materials, routings, and resources screen, where we pull up a specific resource to which we want to assign the setup types that we have defined in our earlier screen. So once we pull up the resource, we click on the setup button, which will be on the bottom of the screen, and it will pull up the setup type screen. Here we can see all available setups. on the left-hand side, and we pull whatever are relevant to be assigned to this particular resource. So once we assign the setup types, we then specify the changeover times in the same screen. Basically, there is a changeovers button in the assignment screen, and it will pop up a changeover times screen. Here we select setup type from setup types to setup type, and we can select it through select button on the top, or even we can find in the find window, because in general there will be so many setup types, so we can always search them. Once we select all possible setup types in from and to, then we refresh list of changeovers. We click on that button, then it will generate all combinations, all the matrix combinations it generates. So in practical scenario, right, there may be like more than 10 setup types. At that time, imagine the number of combinations that are going to be generated here. Those will be in thousands and millions. So for that reason, you can always select for what specific combinations you want to set up the data here based on the situation. You can always choose some of them in from and to and generate the specific combinations. And then in this screen, once the combinations are generated, you can specify the duration, unit of measure, and changeover penalty. So this is again a very important field that is considered by ASCP while generating the optimal sequencing. And of course, then the standard operation. So if we are planning to specify a standard operation, run a standard operation as part of the changeover, we can specify here. And the mass update feature. So as I said, the combinations generated here are, very high based on how many setup types we have. So we can use the mass update feature where if a specific set of combinations can be updated with the same value, especially the penalties and UOM, these may be common across multiple combinations. So we can always utilize the mass update feature on the screen. Then once we set up the changeover times, of course, this is a very critical part of the entire setups because the duration and penalties, these are very important for ASCP to look at and come up with an optimal sequencing. And most of the information given here has to be as accurate as possible to get a better output from ASCP. Then moving on to the specifying the setup types in routing step. So here, the setup types are generally associated at a resource sequence level. So to go to the screen, we have to go to bill of materials, routings, and routing screen. We open up the operation resources. At each operation sequence level, we can we can choose a setup type. So this is one place where we assign it to a specific routing step. Then enabling the resource instance level scheduling. So this is again another important setup that needs to be done. So to go to this screen, we need to go to bill of materials, routings, and departments resources. Once we open the resource screen, as you can see, at each resource level, we can check the schedule by instance checkbox. So what this does is, say if you have more than one unit, of course here whenever you have more than one units associated with a resource, you must specify the instances for those 2 units here in the instances screen too. So the specification of instances is required in order to specify an initial setup state for that resource that we do in ASCP that I'll show you in the next slide. And ASCP will schedule resources at the resource instance level only for the sequence dependent resources. And that too, if we specify this particular checkbox, that is when ASCP will schedule at the resource instance level. For non-sequence dependent setup resources, instance level scheduling is not available. So this has to be specified on the ERP source side. Then moving on to specifying the initial setup state. So this is again happening on the advanced supply chain planning side. This is on the destination side. So of course, before we go to this place, we need to run the collections, and once the data comes into ASCP, then we can go to the collections, advanced supply chain planning responsibility. We can look at the view collected data, and under the resources window, we can see the resources here. And once you click on the instances against that particular resource, you can see the instances that we have defined on the source side. Here, the field, the initial setup state, this is what we need to specify here. Basically, this state will determine whether the first activity that is scheduled on the resource would need a changeover or not. So that is what this signifies. So this initial setup state can be specified only in this collections workbench and ASCP. It cannot be specified in any on the source side. There is no specification in the source ERP system to do this. Then moving on to the sequencing window size. So again, this is under department resources, where we have seen earlier on the main tab, we specified the instance level scheduling, and on the planning tab, we specify the sequencing window in days. So what ASCP does by using this field is it will try to group all the activities of the same setup type together. Say if I put a number of days as 10 in this example, say what ASCP does is within these 10 days, it will try to find another activity or set of activities of the same setup type, and it will group them together for giving us a better and optimal sequencing of activities. And this value can be specified for each resource in this particular window, or it can be a default value coming from a profile option, which I'll show you in the subsequent slides, in which profile option you can set it up. And again, setting up the plan options. Here, this is again under advanced supply chain planning side. Once we open the supply chain plan and options, you can select a plan and go to the constraints tab, where the sequence dependent setups field is available, which can be set up at days, weeks, or periods level. And to enable it, we need to at least select the days level as yes. So that is when it will be available for that plan. Then optionally, you can also add a demand lateness penalty. This is again another important field, which is very useful for ASCP, if at all mentioned, to plan better and get a better optimal sequencing based on this lateness penalty. It is generally traded off with changeover penalty that we have defined earlier in ERP in the previous slides, and the changeover time setup. So it will trade it off against that, and it will decide whether to do a changeover to get the demand scheduled on time, or to avoid the changeover and let the demand go late. So that kind of a decision ASCP takes based on the penalties that we define, the way we define. And in general, ASCP also performs the trade-offs between demand lateness penalties and changeover times and changeover penalties, and also the available capacity. Meaning, say if you have a capacity constraint plan, ASCP will always respect the resource capacity constraints. Then it may choose to delay the demands in order to avoid taking a changeover, and vice versa. That all depends on how we set it up, basically how we set up the penalties and the other profile options and other data that we are going to set up. And moving on to the key profile options as part of the SDS setups. There are a bunch of profile options with which we can play around to get a better and optimal sequencing coming out of ASCP. And one of the profile options here I want to call out is the second one, the default resource sequencing window. So the resource sequencing window is something that we set up in the department resources in the earlier slides. Say if we mention a value in this profile option, ASCP will consider this value if at all for a specific resource there is no resource sequencing defined in the department resources screen. And the rest of the profile options, obviously we can, we can go through and change accordingly and see how the output is, and we can play around with that to get a optimal sequencing. Then reviewing the preferred sequence. So once the setups are all done, we need to run the plan. So once the plan is run, once the plan output is generated, we go to Planner's Workbench. Under Resources, we go to Changeovers. So that's the screen it is. So in this, ASCP generates the preferred sequence based on the changeover matrix that we provided and setup matrix, saying changeover times. And if you see this setup ring sequence number, wherever that is populated with 0, 1, 2, 3 here in this case, these are the ones that ASCP considers as a preferred sequence based on all the inputs that we have provided. And once the sequence is generated, ASCP tries to stick to this sequence while scheduling the activities. And the remaining activities below the box, those are the ones that ASCP will try to avoid as much as possible. And then comparing the setup time and runtime hours. This is more for analysis for the planners. And again, to go to this place, you need to go to Planner's Workbench and Resources and Horizontal Plan. Planners can review the percentage of total time spent on setup and total time for the run hours. So if they think, they can always compare these percentages with whether those are within the thresholds that they have defined. And if they think these are within the threshold, they will move on to subsequent activities. And if they don't think that these are not within the thresholds that they have, they can always adjust the sequence of activities on the resources and rerun the plan and further optimize it that way. So that's how they optimize it, by analyzing the data from the horizontal plan. But if they think the thresholds, the percentages are within the threshold limits, they can further go and review the demand satisfaction dates and purchase recommendations that are given by the plan, and they can release the purchase requisitions, work orders, and they can also further optimize the sequence of work orders in the near-term horizon using the production scheduling. All those things they can do, of course, analyzing based on the data that they see here on the horizontal plan. And then adjusting the sequence of activities. So this is again under Planner's Workbench, Resources. If you open the Gantt chart, it will show the data, the sequence of activities on this Gantt chart. And they can always manipulate this data, resequence it the way they want to meet their specific requirements. And the ASCP generates the output by considering the parameters, but in reality, things could be different based on the practical situations. So they can always rearrange the sequences as they want, and they can manually override the plan output. And these are the high-level setups that are required. And with that, I'll hand it over back to Nick.
Thank you, Chandra. That was critical information for anybody considering sequence-dependent setups for them to be aware of. So now that we have an understanding of the required data and setups, let's examine a simple example of before and after employing sequence-dependent setups. So here's a very simplified version of what a production line could look like before using sequence-dependent setups. We see that the setup times are essentially baked into the operations, right? They're there, they exist. In one form or another, we know we need to perform changeovers or setups, but we don't necessarily account for them. And there's numerous ways to do this, right? By reducing the utilization percentage, maybe reducing throughput speed on the line itself, or even adding an additional operation step to the routing to account for changeovers. Now, this method is sufficient for basic capacity planning, but it does subvert ASCP from delivering an optimized resource schedule. In this particular example, ASCP is blind to changeovers and their impact on the efficiency and utilization of the resource line. Plainly put, if we don't define changeover and setup times in our planning system, there's no way for us to measure them, there's no way for us to improve them, and there's no way for us to control them. Again, taking the same very simple example, after making the necessary data and parameter changes to utilize sequence-dependent setups, we see the obvious reduction in setup time and a more accurate work order duration. Our white boxes and blue boxes have actually shrunk in terms of their duration. Our KPI, if we're measuring it around asset utilization, will be more accurate. And since our setup times are now measurable, we can work to improve our planned efficiency. Let's take a moment to cover some of the dependencies and interactions. First of all, to use sequence-dependent setups, we have to be using a constrained supply plan in ASCP. An unconstrained plan will simply not work for using sequence-dependent setups. Second, I want to call attention to something that Chandra mentioned earlier briefly. Sequence-dependent setups do not supersede demand due dates unless we define our penalties to be set up differently. So going back to what Chandra covered with regard to penalties and priorities around demand lateness versus changeover penalties. So without some direct interaction of those outweighing one another specifically to your business needs, sequence-dependent setups will not minimize changeovers at the expense of fulfilling an order by its due date. Third, need to have e-business suite or a very similarly mapped master data fields in your current ERP system. Right? As Chandra walked us through, there is a lot of master data and planning data that needs to be input for us to leverage this functionality. And last, if you are using Oracle WIP or shop floor management, there are some additional changes required to accommodate sequence-dependent setups. For more information on that, you can contact AVATA and we can help walk through some of that. So with that said, I'll turn it back over to Deb and we'll begin to open up the floor for Q&A.
Thank you, Nick. At this time, we're going to open up the forum to answer any questions that you might have about the content that was presented. Sanjay, can you please walk us through any questions that have been submitted so far?
Absolutely. And Nick and Chandra, that was great information. Thank you for that. A couple of questions that came around. First was around a comparison between Oracle production scheduling and SDS. Is SDS a replacement of PS, or how they are different?
Yes, Sanjay, I can take that one. And that's a good question because there is some shared functionality there and there is some similarities. So you're correct that sequence-dependent setups are very similar to the changeover matrix that's used in Oracle production scheduling or PS. Let me be clear though, sequence-dependent setups in ASCP is not a replacement for Oracle production scheduling. PS is extremely effective for scheduling manufacturing execution down to the minute, right? And kind of the near term, next few days, next few weeks, maybe out 30 days, depending on how you're using it. And utilizing sequence-dependent setups is more applicable to capacity and material planning in that mid to long-term planning function, so that we can see beyond 30 days and we're planning into the future a little bit further than down to the minute on the shop floor itself.
All right. The second question that came along is, we talked about some flavors of discrete manufacturing. Are the setups for the process manufacturing similar? Any comments on that?
Yeah, so we chose to focus on discrete for the purposes of this presentation, but we do have information available to us which we can provide to those who have process manufacturing. If we want to meet outside of this particular forum, we've got that information and we can provide it. I will default to Chandra if he wants to give us a high-level overview of the differences, but if not, we can certainly follow up with supporting information on the different setups for process manufacturing. Chandra, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, there are very few differences for the process manufacturing, and 2 or 3 different category related setups. Those setups are required, but again, I can provide that information that is available. It is little different than discrete, but in grand scheme of things, pretty similar.
All right. Thank you for that. The third question that came around was, so somewhere in the slide deck, it was mentioned that SDS can help manage inventory and procurement activities. And then it was mentioned that SDS could help improve order promising. Can you explain that a little bit, Nick?
Yeah. So this is a really good point to expand on a little bit, because it's easier to understand kind of the improvements from an inventory management and procurement perspective. Order promising is a little bit more dependent on what the specific application is within, somebody's particular business. But basically, the benefit of having greater ability to promise orders with accuracy is applicable in certain scenarios where providing promise dates of order fulfillment is important to the customer itself. So if we imagine a scenario where maybe the customer is a big box retailer who experiences some seasonality, and they're trying to place their orders for peak demand out into the future, the improved accuracy of the ASCP plan, where sequence-dependent setups are utilized, could mean the difference between promising order fulfillment within a couple of days to this customer. So promising them their order fulfillment on a Thursday or Friday may be vastly different than promising them order fulfillment on a Monday or Tuesday. So it all depends on how certain customer service levels are measured with regard to your existing customers, but the potential to reap that benefit is there using sequence-dependent setups.
All right, awesome. So those were some of the key questions that I am seeing. Thank you for asking those questions. I'm not seeing any other questions. That you want to proceed with the next step?
Sure, we'll move on and just cover some final thoughts before we conclude.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. So just a couple of things to finish on, some final thoughts. So using sequence-dependent setups, of course, drives work order sequencing within the parameters that we define, right? So those demand priorities, changeover penalties, things like that. That's the big benefit. As Chandra walked us through, the data setup is critical and will require a lot of diligence, not just to set up itself, but to maintain as business needs change. And lastly, from the benefits perspective, it will improve shop floor efficiency, but there are some potential improvements in other functional areas. In fact, this is very similar to the question that I just addressed. So inventory management, right? So we're reducing that scrap, or we're purchasing materials closer to the time that they're needed. And then order management, order promising, order fulfillment, all of that kind of funnels into that as well.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks Chandra and Sanjay for facilitating and helping out with this webinar today. Before we wrap up, we would like to invite you to connect with us if you're planning to attend the Modern Business Experience Conference in Las Vegas coming up next month. We will be exhibiting in 3 different locations and have a number of customer speaker presentations as well. AVATA is also hosting a networking event at Topgolf, and if you're interested in joining us, please reach out to us for an invitation. And as always, we invite you to contact us via email, visit our website, or follow us on social media to learn more. Thank you for joining us, and enjoy your day.